He called her a deadweight as the divorce papers slipped from his hand and fluttered across the hospital floor. The words landed louder than the thud of her heart monitor. Natasha's laugh, a small, practiced thing, cut through the sterile air like a knife wrapped in silk. Elena lay propped against pillows, IV dripping, a thin sheet clinging to legs that had not yet relearned how to bear her weight. Around them the hospital hummed with indifferent life. Fluorescent lights, low conversations behind curtain seams, the impatient beep of machines that measured recovery in numbers and pauses. Vincent stood too tall for the room, the tailored suit too bright against the gray of the day. He held one hand on the back of a chair as if steadying himself for a performance. When he looked at Elena, there was no softness, only the contempt of someone who had decided he had paid his dues and was ready to collect what he believed owed to him. "You've been a liability for too long," he said, not a whisper, but not quite a shout. "Dead weight. I can't carry both of us anymore." The phrase belonged to a man who had learned to convert people into ledgers and relationships into line items. It should have been private. Instead, it became a verdict. The nurse's clipboard trembled as it dropped from her hand. A young orderly in the doorway pretended not to hear, eyes averted. Natasha leaned forward as if to gather the scene into her palms like a keepsake. Elena's response was not a sound. For a heartbeat she watched him, watched the way the light caught the cut of his jaw, the cheap arrogance of a man who believed that success had made him incorruptible. The room smelled of antiseptic and citrus hand soap. There was a faint, persistent ache along the length of her spine that made the act of breathing a negotiation with pain. Yet beneath that ache, something else settled into place. Not fear, not pleading. A quiet, composed decision. He assumed he had already discarded her. He assumed too much. If anything in Elena's life had been inevitable, it had been shaped by contrary moments, small acts of stubbornness that had become the architecture of who she was. She had not been born into the Castellano name. She had inherited it, and with it, a responsibility that was as heavy as it was gilded. Her father had loved spectacle and numbers in equal measure. He taught her to read a balance sheet like a poem. He taught her that sometimes the truest power came wrapped in patience and the ability to stare down a clock until it changed its tune. Vincent's hand trembled when he touched her chart. Natasha reached for his sleeve as if to steady him, but he was steady enough to sign. He liked the idea of being decisive. Decision, he had learned, often turned into ownership. Ownership, in his mind, meant freedom from any tether, emotion, loyalty, legal obligation that might weigh down his ascent. Elena watched him sign the paper that would later be photographed for gossip columns, the paper that was meant to signal the end. The cameras would eat it up, edit the small snapshot of this room into a headline. A once-power couple dissolves amid scandal. In those frames, she would be the infirm trophy, the collapsed dynasty clinging to an IV pole. The optics were everything. He had always been careful with optics. It is what made him dangerous. But a private gesture, clipped by arrogance, had a way of revealing deeper truths. As Vincent turned to leave, a faint sound brushed the edges of Elena's consciousness. An afterthought, a muttered line that had not been intended for his exit. She wasn't sure if it was the way the carpet swallowed sound or the way her own head catalogued things in a slow, patient way, but she caught a phrase, a cadence she would not later forget. If she disappears, no one will contest the transfer. That thought, blunt, obscene, split the room like light. It was not merely betrayal, it was something darker, a calculation that measured her life in assets and liabilities. She had always known that money could harden people into sharp implements. She had not expected it to aim at her with such callous efficiency. When he left a coldness that made the monitors sound like distant thunder. Natasha's smile did not reach her eyes. The room filled with small gestures. A nurse rearranged the sheets. A doctor signed the chart. Vincent's shoes faded down the corridor. The divorce paper stuck to the sole of his shoe for a moment and then came free. A scrap of her life that would be sniffed at and judged. Elena stared at it. She could have begged. She could have let the world take the image and compress it until even she could not remember what had once been her will. She could have disappeared into pity and rehabilitation and the soft, endless pity of charity dinners. Everyone would have expected that. Everyone would have nodded and said, "She had such a good heart." Instead, somewhere quiet and deliberate, Elena began to inventory what she had left. If this is where the story ends, it would be a portrait of tragedy. But then, tragedies are for people who surrender to what is given. Elena did not. Her mind, even in pain, began to trace the architecture of possibility. Not revenge for its own sake, but a reclamation of integrity and agency. It is one thing to be betrayed. It is another thing entirely to allow betrayal to become the final taking. Before the day was out, her attorney, James Harrison, was at her bedside. He had the professional calm of someone accustomed to reading other people's crises like weather patterns. He brought a kind of warmth that was not sentimentality but steady competence. James did not offer platitudes. He asked questions, the right ones. Who knew what? Who controlled what? Which entities were in their names? Which accounts could be accessed? Elena answered with full accuracy. She had, before the accident, taken steps anyone careful with high-stakes family business would take: trusts, separate entities, contingency planning. Those steps were not glamour. They were the architecture of preservation. Her father had instilled in her not only the language of balance sheets, but also the discipline of securing what mattered against the winds of greed. He had taught that money without a plan was simply a temptation for the worst in people. James listened, nodded, made notes. He did not flinch at the mention of Natasha's name or Vincent's casual cruelty. "We will protect you," he said. The words were not promises of a fairy tale. They were legal strategy. They were the placement of pieces on a board that had, until now, been set by others. In the hours after the fracture of that room, people turned up bearing varying gestures of support. Some were sincere. Some inhabited the space of obligation with the performance of compassion. Cameras flexed outside the hospital doors like curious creatures waiting for blood. Rumors formed in the thumbnails of news feeds: a marriage in trouble, a CEO collapses, an heiress in crisis. Hashtags breathed life into speculation. The world loves a narrative of fall. Elena let them look. She let them whisper. She let them believe what they wanted for now. There was power in being underestimated. If you'd rather hear about the later twist of events, about the moment she walked into a room where her rivals believed they had already won and turned the world on its head, stay with this story. If you love Come From Behind tales, subscribe to our channel. There's more coming that you won't want to miss. She had been a student once, of numbers and strategy, and later of the fragile human theater that surrounds them. In college, she had met Vincent at a charity gala, the kind of event where people practice benevolence for the clarity of their names. He presented as dizzying possibility, charm measured against an inner hunger. He was quick, witty, good at making people feel like the center of a plot in which he himself was always the hero. At first, their partnership was a collision of complementary ambitions. Elena had a mind that could map markets. Vincent had an appetite for risk that welcomed her cautious counterweights. They built, fast, hungry, shimmering, a company that harvested attention and turned it into capital. Originally, the Castellano name had been a lighthouse. Now it was a brand, an engine. They were an image people could monetize. Two brilliant young leaders, equal halves of a single empire. But empires demand narratives. People like simple arcs: rise, consolidation, dominion. Complexity unsettled the investors and the public who liked their leaders unambiguous. Elena's carefulness was not always photogenic. She deliberated where Vincent lipped. Where she asked a second opinion, he saw hesitation. Resentment, subtle at first, grew in the cracks. When her father died, the shape of their lives shifted. He left the majority stake to Elena, trusting her to steward a legacy that had been more family than firm. In doing so, he also handed her a target. Vincent had never been coy about his feelings. Loyalty was admirable until it became a chain. He began to speak in different tones, emphasizing efficiency, questioning the necessity of some philanthropic arms, proposing a realignment of board seats. At dinners, his sentences carried the undercurrent of a man who saw himself as practical and indispensable. Natasha arrived later, a social director who knew how to make herself useful. She was warm in the public square and cold in secluded phone calls. At first, she was Elena's friend, someone who could pick out a dress, manage a donor list, make small talk feel like a bridge. She had charm and the appearance of discretion. But charm is often a cloak, and discretion, a performance. Underneath, Natasha had learned to read influence like a map. The affair started the way such things often do, small privatizations, a text that shouldn't have been sent, a lunch that lasted too long, a shared laugh caught and held. Where Elena saw the fraying seams of intimacy and worked to mend them with presence and patience, Natasha and Vincent stitched a different pattern, one of secrecy and silent consent. For months, Elena felt the shift like a tremor under the floorboards. Arguments about the company, once stimulative, became bathed in a different light. Meetings ended with Vincent absent, or with his tone sharp like a scalpel. Natasha began to show up more often at board functions, at the edge of photos, at dinners where she positioned herself between partners and decision-makers. Rumors curled like smoke, and Elena, who preferred to analyze rather than dramatize, gathered facts. She is not a woman who pined in private, she acted. She confronted them in the privacy of a penthouse terrace. Vincent offered a practiced apology, a petulant insistence that he loved her, that the work had tired him. Natasha feigned surprise. The three of them danced the thin dance of denials. But there are lines in every human dynamic that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Adultery is more than physical. It is a transference of the intimate currency that binds trust. For Elena, it was clear. A choice had been made. When the car left the road, it did so with the normal cruelty of accidents. There was no malicious hand, no cinematic villain at the wheel. A rain-slicked curve and a moment's miscalculation produced a metal language of twisted frames and glass. Elena's SUV spun off into a guardrail. The vehicle crumpled like a paper boat against the tide. Emergency lights answered like a chorus. The world contracted to the size of a stretcher and an oxygen mask, and a voice insisting, "Keep her breathing." She woke in pieces. There was, briefly, a wonderful absence of memory. Then pain arrived with the surety of truth. Her spine had been compromised. They told her she might walk again, slowly, carefully, or she might not. The future had shifted into conditional tense. Hospital corridors become places where people learn to disguise how raw they feel. The staff moves like musicians, efficient, practiced, comforting in the way strangers can be. Visitors become gestures, and the public's appetite for spectacle grows. Elena's accident made a story. It made headlines. Vincent's statements were grammatical with concern. Natasha posted perfunctory well wishes and smiling selfies that were cropped in ways that said more than they showed. After the crash, late one night when the monitors kept a patient rhythm and visitors assumed the quiet of the ward, Elena overheard something she should not have. She had learned to listen to the world in ways that others do not. The fashion of the pause between a sentence, the breath that indicates concealed laughter. There was a word buried under the casualness of male cooperation, a phrase that hardened into a stone. Vincent, talking with Natasha in a corridor half-lit by vending machines, said things he thought lost in the ambient noise. Plans to restructure holdings, discussions of timing, references to contingency, and simplifying the estate. He sounded almost bored, like a man discussing summer travel plans. But then he said with a brutal economy of speech, "If she doesn't come back, it will be cleaner." It was not merely callousness, it was a reveal. He had been calculating for months, perhaps longer. Where others might see a marriage in crisis and a tragic accident, he saw possibility. An opportunity to recast his own narrative without messy entanglements. Natasha laughed, the sound small and blank. Elena lay very still and let the sentence settle into her bones. She had experienced betrayal before, but to hear complicit voices strategize about the removal of a person as if they were a line item was different. It was a kind of erasure. The human mind is designed to protect itself with stories. Some narrative threads, once snapped, leave a person free-floating. Elena's story did not snap. It rewired, When the initial flood of pain subsided into a dull, constant companion, she began to think not of retribution, but of preservation and revelation. There are acts that fall squarely within the law and within the realm of moral clarity: gathering evidence, preserving proof, protecting assets, exposing deceit. There are others that cross into the realm of vengeance and illegality. She did not want that path. She was not interested in making herself a mirror of their cruelty. She wanted justice, public and precise. James arrived with a plan outline. Patricia Morrison, an analyst who had once run risk for the company and who owed Elena a debt of loyalty that had nothing to do with contracts, presented spreadsheets printed with more tenderness than most papers deserve. David Strong, a former executive who had been coerced away by Vincent's promises before, found reasons to call himself aligned with Elena again. His reasons were complicated, but at their core lay an ember of conscience. Each person who knelt into Elena's inner circle brought a skill that would turn a private hurt into an architectural problem. Who could secure what assets? What entities held title? Which reputations could be fortified? How would the public narrative be shaped? They did not, in those early meetings, talk about traps or dirty tricks. They talked about contingency, creating legal structures that could act as locks, ensuring that public statements did not erode the trust of investors, mapping out what could be used as incontrovertible proof of malfeasance. Elena listened and asked the right questions. She learned, in this process, to hold emotion like a lens, focused but not blinding. Her rehabilitation began as an intimate conspiracy with medical professionals. Weeks turned into months of physical therapy, painstaking exercise that made small victories into mountains. She moved from bed to chair, from chair to walker, from walker to a cane. Each small step was logged, celebrated, noted. The world saw photos of her making progress. The tabloids parsed every hint of a smile. She allowed them these crumbs. Privately, she practiced a different kind of movement, the choreography of perception. Publicly, she cultivated the image of decline. Fewer interviews, softer statements, an assumed decline in responsibility. She let the rumor of bankruptcy creep into feed lines, not from her, but from the market's appetite for dramatic arcs. Stocks dipped in response to weak guidance. Competitors sharpened their knives. Vincent's circles grew louder. The narrative of Elena's incapacitation fit too neatly into the plan he had long drafted in the margins of emails. But Elena and her team were not simulating collapse to steal from her. They were building a curtain, a stage behind which assets were secured and documents were traced, not to disappear but to be protected from predatory hands. They employed legal architectures, trusts, holding entities, managerial structures that would, if needed, be used to assert claims. Prosecutors and courts rely on evidence, markets rely on reputation. Elena's strategy was to ensure both would be clear should the moment of reveal come. She assembled auditors and kept chains of custody meticulous, because the truth, when presented cleanly, has a clarity that rumor cannot drown. Vincent continued to move as if time was an ally. He began to divest himself of public partnerships and to cozy up to investors who smelled an opportunity. Natasha, skillful in social settings, began to curate an image of a woman stepping into a new role, a philanthropist, a CEO consort, the smiling partner of a man on the ascendant. They began to plan a life where Elena's absence would be the absence of an obstacle and not the hollow of a conscience. One night, months after the crash, Elena sat in her study, the room reborn from an era of mourning into one of calculation. The view over the city was blurred by rain like a watercolored memory. She turned over a photograph, a younger version of herself with her father, both of them smiling at the camera, the angles of their smiles the same. She thought of his voice, his insistence that legacy was not a thing one bequeaths to be conquered, but a duty to be passed on with dignity. She was not interested in spectacle as punishment. She was interested in spectacle as revelation. There are ways to make people reveal themselves without violence, to let their own choices be the instruments of their downfall. The plan that took shape in her mind was less about humiliation for its own sake and more about exposing the rot that had been allowed to fester. If Vincent believed he could accelerate his freedom by clearing the debris of marriage, then she would make sure that the debris included his reputation. To do that, she would need to be patient. She would need to control narratives and timelines, to protect assets in ways that looked like surrender but in fact were methodical defense. She would work through legal counsel and trusted analysts. She would let him expose himself. She would use the market's appetite for drama to reveal the fissures he had tried to paper over. She chose her allies with the care of someone who knew how people bend under pressure. James understood the law. Patricia understood perception. David understood the market. Michelle Torres, a communications director whose exile during Vincent's early consolidation had taught her a few truths about brand survival, would shape the public image like armor. They would not fabricate. They would set the stage where truth could speak loudly enough to be heard through the noise. In the first sequence of moves, Elena authorized a controlled vulnerability. She instructed James to publish a press release that admitted to operational pauses and to request more time for a formal audit, a language that is timid on the surface but opens the door for predators to step in. They would not commit fraud. They would not falsify documents. What they would do was create an appearance, a carefully engineered perception, that would invite the very actions they wanted on record. It was a test, to see what Vincent would do when presented with the prospect of her financial irrelevance. She allowed a small, monitored sum to be visible, an amount significant enough to tempt but not catastrophic to the enterprise's foundation. She wanted to know whether he would seize that sum for clarity or give it up in the face of moral scrutiny. She wanted to know where his loyalties truly lay. When the first wire went missing, when $3 million left an account that was publicly reported as part of a transfer, Vincent did not hesitate. He made moves that were both crude and eloquent. Bills paid in haste, transfers announced in private meetings, a swift reconfiguration of his position to appear benevolent to investors while securing his new life. Natasha celebrated in photographed smiles. He believed he had nothing to hide. Elena watched the transfers the same way she had once watched the market react to quarterly numbers, calmly, with an analyst's interest. Each transaction was a syllable in a confession, each hurried signature a testimony. They collected records, saved receipts, stored server logs. They kept everything clean and accessible, because evidence that can be presented court-ready does not require malice to be effective. The longer she waited, the more the world accepted the script. The press compounded the image of a woman breathing but receding, of a company in the slow contracting pulse of bad management. Vincent's new life began to take shape. Weekend homes, evenings filled with investors who congratulated him on the courage to move on. Natasha sat at his side in photos, hands folded like a trophy. If Elena had sought to anger him, she would have taken another route. Instead, her approach was surgical. She drained the stage of ambiguity, replacing rumor with documents, suspicion with demonstrable patterns. The social and financial ecosystem that had made Vincent tasted more human than he expected. Investors do not like uncertainty. Markets punish the smell of instability. Reputation is fragile. When it cracks, it splinters fast. As Elena's body regained its strength, through discipline, through therapy, through a rigorous program of strengthening that left her exhausted but inching forward, her mind remained sharper than ever. Her physical limitations taught her to conserve energy for decisions that mattered. Where once she might have confronted her enemies with a public fury, now she chose a quieter path, exposed through evidence. Let the world correct what men hide when unchecked. There were nights of doubt, true and piercing. There were moments when the pain felt like a tether and the headlines like a shroud. There were people who offered counsel that leaned toward vengeance, toward theatrics that might gratify for a night and destroy for a lifetime. Elena refused. She remembered her father's quiet insistence on legacy over spectacle. She was going to reclaim what was hers, not by ruin, but by restoring order. Legal, reputational, human. When Vincent and Natasha announced their engagement, an event staged with the precision of a brand launch, it was, if anything, audacious. They sent invitations embossed in gold to a curated list of the city's movers and shakers. The gala would be photographed. It would be framed as triumph. Their circle toasted a future built on the absent shoulders of the woman they had pushed aside. Elena watched the save-the-date emails with a measured smile. She did not see the event as something to crash or to curse. She saw it as a stage, the stage on which the man and the woman who believed themselves untouchable would perform their consent to one another and to their own narrative. She planned to attend, not as a wounded ghost, but as a living witness. She had learned not to be an audience to her own humiliation. It is tempting in stories like this to conjure a one-minute transformation, bedridden to red carpet. That is not how reality operates. Elena's recovery was measured. She learned to stand with the prosthetic steadiness of someone who has relearned the rules of balancing, both bodily and strategically. She practiced short walks in spare practice rooms, first with the assistance of a therapist, then with the private confidence of heels that clicked like punctuation. The team continued to assemble. An auditor named Robert Clean traced the transfer patterns and, with Patricia, outlined a chain of transactions that would look, to an impartial observer, like opportunism disguised as necessity. Michelle prepared talking points that would, when the time came, communicate a simple truth. The company had been misled. People react to facts. Facts stacked in order become irresistible. And yet patience is a currency in itself. They could not rush. They could not cheapen the evidence by handing it to the press too early. They needed timing, and they needed public context. The wedding would provide both. A public convergence of witnesses, cameras, and the social oxygen that fuels investor reaction. It would be a place where people thought only of celebration, and thus were blind to the subtext of exposure. Elena walked slowly through the practice of appearing diminished. She gave a few interviews that were soft in tone, her sentences clipped to evoke fatigue and resilience. Her public statements were legal and emotional, precise and human. They trusted that public sympathy would not last forever. They trust that the market would respond to clarity. That clarity would be curated, not invented. There are moments in any well-constructed plan when the planner must choose the exact pitch of a reveal. Too early and the moment lacks force. Too late and opponents escape. Elena weighed these things like an investor weighing risk. She had the facts. She had the patience. She had the team. Now she needed the moment. On an overcast afternoon, Vincent sent an email to a small group of investors, a triumphant recap of mergers and prospective ventures, a subtle note that the company was repositioning and that he had secured certain personal lines of funding to stabilize operations. It was the kind of email sent with the casual arrogance of a man who believes he can rewrite the past with a line of prose. He attached a photo of himself and Natasha smiling on a yacht, the sunlight flattering them as if to suggest that light itself had chosen their union. Elena felt something thawing in her chest, not joy, not hatred, but the composed expectation of a person who knows the rules of exposure. The next move would be to orchestrate a public stage big enough that people would stop to watch. The wedding would be that stage. James advised caution. "We will not rush the narrative," he said. "We will allow their choices to reveal themselves. We will document with precision, and when the time is right, we will let the public see what we have seen." "Will there be legal consequences?" Patricia asked, voice low. "There should be," James replied, and his tone carried the measured hope of someone who believed in systems more than theatrics. "But consequences require proof, and proof requires patience." Elena rested her hand on the arm of the chair and imagined the wedding as a play. Spotlights, music, guests sushi barked by photographers, an environment where a single word, spoken at the right decibel, could detonate a cumulative reputational damage. She had rehearsed everything in her head, the reveal of the recorded conversation where Vincent joked about her disappearance, the presentation of the transaction trail, the moment when investors realized their dollars had been redirected from corporate stability to the private indulgences of a man on the make. There would be no physical confrontation. There would be no threats. There would be documents, witnesses, and the cold glare of receipts. She would allow the law to do its exacting, unromantic work. Vindication, if it came, would be procedural and public. Yet Elena's plan was not only about demolition, it was about reclamation. She wanted her name cleaned, not smeared, her father's legacy honored, not plundered. There was a different kind of pride at stake, the pride of a steward who refused to be written out of the story. When the day came to walk the corporate halls again, She practiced the posture of a woman who had regained her center. There is an art to appearing whole when one is not yet entirely so, a negotiation of breath and visual narrative. She cultivated it with precision. Her cane became an accessory rather than a confession. Her voice, when she used it, was controlled. She could, in a room full of people, project both fragility and steely resolve. It was the kind of duality that unsettled those who had expected to see her flattened. And so the slow, deliberate machinery of exposure began to turn. Documents were prepared. Depositions were scheduled in the way legal people schedule storms, with the certainty that chaos will follow. The press would get a hint. Investors would get a nudge. The wedding invitation, so brass and glossy, would arrive like an omen. Elena scheduled one meeting that would, in quiet ways, change everything. She asked James, Patricia, David, Michelle, and Robert to come together in a room that smelled like lemon polish and old money, a space where the trappings of the city's elite gathered in a neutral hush. They joked a little, a brittle laughter to cut the tension. Then they methodically reviewed the bank statements, the server logs, the texts. They reviewed the time windows of transfers. They matched calendars and phone pings and the small telling digital footprints of people who think themselves invisible. When the documents lay before them like a map, the picture was ugly in its economy. There were transfers moved in the gray hours. There were memos that hinted at sensitivity without stating the thing that sensitivity protected. It was less the explicit proof of malevolent action than the pattern of a man who had ceased to weigh consequences for others. "He's sloppy," Robert said, in that clinical tone auditors develop to soften the sting of truth. "He keeps receipts in the open. He likes the quick wins. He thinks speed can paper over guilt." "That's his flaw," Patricia replied. "He equates visibility with safety. He doesn't understand that visibility can be the opposite, if you know how to frame it." Elena listened and nodded. She had learned to use language like a scalpel, precise and clean. "Then we'll use his speed against him," she said. "We'll let his haste be his confession." As the meeting broke, their faces were set, but not triumphant. There was no glee in the room, only a heavy responsibility. They were about to move in a world that would judge them for making public the intimate machinations of men's greed. It was not a decision to be made lightly. They would hold themselves to a standard that their adversaries had never considered necessary. Outside, the city continued the business of forgetting. A woman with a stroller hurried past. A delivery truck rattled graffiti down the curb. The rain subsided to a shimmer. Elena left with the weight of action on her shoulders, not light but not immovable. She felt, in a strange way, liberated. There are times when being underestimated is a kind of freedom. People underestimate a woman who uses disadvantage as an instrument. The next weeks promised to be busy. Small moves, documented and legal. James would file certain motions. Robert and Patricia would prepare a packet of data to submit to regulators if needed. Michelle would prepare messaging that would thread the needle between personal dignity and public truth. David would quietly reach out to a few investors, not to bribe them or to manipulate markets, but to present a sober, evidence-backed alternative to the rumor-fueled panic. They did not talk about the wedding as a final stage in this room. They spoke of it as a public event in which many of their enemies would be on display. There are tactical advantages to a crowd. Witness is complicating of private lies. They would simply be ready when the spotlight was on. Elena walked past a glass-fronted cafe on the way home and caught sight of herself reflected in the window. The woman who stared back had dark circles under her eyes and a faint scar along one brow. Yet there was a steadiness to the line of her jaw that had not been there months ago. She practiced a small private smile, the kind that says, "I'm still here," and then continued. Night fell with the intermittent glow of city lights and the half-breath that precedes major weather. Plans require a totalizing attention, but they also require rest. Elena slept in phases, kinking awake at odd hours to check messages, to consider a new data point, to review a transcript. Once, she dreamed of the hospital room and the divorce papers, and Vincent's hand shaking as he left. The dream provided no pity, only clarity. When she awoke, she rose and did the small rituals of someone preparing to meet the world. A measured breakfast, a session with a physical therapist that left her exhausted and satisfied, a call to James that fixed the next day's legal patch. She glanced at a photograph of her father on the mantel. It was not a talisman. It was the reminder of a standard. There are movements in life when you cross into a threshold and cannot return to the previous shape of things. Elena felt that now. The person who had been labeled dead weight in a grim hospital room would not accept that epithet as a definition. She would not inhabit the narrative others had written for her. Outside, the city seemed unaware of the small arc that was completing itself. The patient was no longer purely patient. She was becoming a strategist. She was learning the strange alchemy of taking damage and turning it into leverage. The plan would demand that she return to public view at strategically chosen moments, that she allow some appearances of decline while guarding the lifelines that actually mattered. It would demand discipline, not drama. It would demand proof, not rhetoric. And if they thought that by marrying each other they could seal their advantage, they had not reckoned with the possibility of a public witness who had decided, with quiet ferocity, to insist on accountability. She practiced walking again in the quiet of her home, feeling her weight shift with the muscle memory of someone who relearns the world one step at a time. The cane tapped the floor. She thought of all the things they had tried to take from her. Love, dignity, the right to steward a legacy. They had underestimated the value of the things that are not visible to the eye. Composure, patience, a mind that can hold a plan long enough to wait for it to ripen. A message pinged her phone. The wedding invitations had gone out. The RSVP date was printed like a dare. In small black letters beneath the gilded announcement was a note that the ceremony would be private, but that a reception would follow at a center beloved by the city's elite. Elena read the line twice and then smiled without irony. She could see it, a room filled with guests who had taken sides, a stage decorated with the trimmings of power. It was, precisely, the kind of occasion where truth could resonate loudly if presented with the right clarity. The first part of her plan, patience, documentation, the protection of assets, was complete in its initial phase. The next phase required presence. She would attend, not to confront or to beg, but to stand as the living testament to the fact that being called a dead weight does not dictate a person's trajectory. She picked up the divorce paper that had once fluttered at her feet and smoothed it flat on the table. It was a thin, simple thing made from the same material as so many lives, words with an economic intent. She could have allowed the word dead weight to settle into her identity. Instead, she would reacquaint the world with the full measure of who she was, measured, patient, and not to be underestimated. Outside, rain started again, soft and steady, wiping the city's angles into a painting. Inside, Elena closed her eyes and mapped the sequence she would follow: protect, document, expose, reclaim. Each verb had a weight. Each weight had a timeline, and in those timelines she found a kind of freedom. They thought they had left her behind. They had not accounted for what happens when someone the world has underestimated chooses to use that underestimation as camouflage. They had not accounted for a woman who, while healing her body, was building a dismantling of lies with the impartial tools of evidence and patience. The first moves were made. The pieces were set. The game, for now, shifted from private injury to public arithmetic. The narrative that Vincent and Natasha had cultivated, of ascension and new beginnings, would soon be tested against the cold, inexorable logic of documented choices. Elena rested for the evening, not as someone sated by revenge, but as someone preparing for the next measure of justice. She had no desire to be cruel. She had only the desire to reclaim what had been done to her by those who thought themselves practical men. She would not be an object within their story. She would be the author of her next chapter. She rose at dawn to another day of therapy and meetings. In the quiet before she left, she rehearsed under her breath a sentence she knew would one day need to be spoken aloud. "You miscalculated. You thought I would be silent." She did not yet speak it. The words were a promise she kept folded inside a pocket of patience. For now she would move as someone who had rehearsed victory in silence. The invitations had promised champagne and orchestral strings, Instead, they provided the perfect theater. The reception hall, an old conservatory turned event space, glass and ironwork and chandeliers, filled with the city's usual constellation. Portfolio managers in slim suits, assorted philanthropists practicing their interested smiles, social editors with lenses ready. Flowers softened corners. Waiters circulated with trays as if nothing precarious was about to happen. Elena arrived with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows how important first frames are. Her cane was discreet, a lacquered thing that matched the understated cut of her coat as she stepped from the car. She wore a coat over a dress the color of wet asphalt, refined without flourish. Her hair was pulled back, the line of her jaw clean and unguarded. Those who expected a specter of pity saw, at first, only composure. Those who expected spectacle saw no spectacle, which made what came next cut deeper. Her team was by her side, James steady, Patricia with a folder tucked under her arm like a talisman, Michelle with a small device that would be the mechanism for the reveal. David and Robert moved through the room as if they belonged. In some ways they did now, as custodians of evidence and witnesses who knew how to speak calmly while chaos brewed. Vincent and Natasha were center stage, as rehearsed. He smiled with the practiced fatigue of a man who believed the world owed him praise for endurance, not accountability. She was luminous in a dress that swallowed light. They moved among guests like primes in a social equation, each handshake a calculation. Cameras clicked, champagne flowed. The air vibrated with polite curiosity and the low hum of people congratulating each other on good judgment. Elena allowed herself a single breath, and then she stepped into the room. The murmur stilled, not the shocked silence of dramatics, but the precise, measured hush that comes when someone the world thought broken reappears in the configuration of power. Her cane tapped once on the marble and the sound caught like a punctuation mark. Patrons turned, phones lifted. For a moment the event became what it truly was, a public stage with many witnesses. She did not walk like someone seeking revenge. She walked like someone claiming space. When she reached the front of the room, she asked not for a microphone, but for the attention that happens naturally when someone who has been underestimated chooses to speak. There was a breathless second as she removed her coat and set it over a chair. She placed the cane by her side and faced them, not with pleading, not with rage, but with an economy of presence that made the room lean forward. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was steady, practiced, unhurried. "I did not come to haunt anyone. I came to offer clarity." There were polite chuckles, until a small device in Michelle's hands clicked, and the projection screen at the head of the room blinked to life. The display showed a photograph of a hospital room, then the divorce paper that had once fluttered across Elena's lap. It is a dangerous thing, the sudden arrow of relevance. Cameras angled toward the screen, editors' fingers twitching. Elena let the silence hold. "Tonight," she continued, "you celebrate a union built on convenience and omission. You do not know the full ledger." At that, she played a recording. It was short. Vincent's voice captured in a corridor, a phrasing cruel in its casualness. "If she doesn't come back, it will be cleaner." The words landed like slag. There was no theatrical distortion, no manipulation. The room shifted in its seat. Some laughed, dismissing it as a bad quip. Others looked sideways, trying to reconcile the warmth of a photograph with the chill of a recorded remark. Elena did not need to speak for a long time. The recording did its work. Then she clicked to the next slide, a ledger with highlighted lines, timestamps, a trail of transfers that moved like a breadcrumb path across accounts. $3 million, one line read $3,000, moved in a pattern that could not be explained by ordinary corporate housekeeping. The funds were sent to accounts associated with personal purchases and investments that had nothing to do with stabilizing the company. She let the data sit for a beat. People read the numbers on the screen. They read the memo fields in the slide. Personal line, immediate stabilization, vendor payback, private arrangement. The language was familiar to anyone in the room who had ever watched a company pivot. It looked, to many eyes now, less like courage and more like appropriation. "Those who manage money for others," Elena said softly, have a duty to report when the money they are given is used for personal gain, and those who accept such gains have a duty to the truth. Vincent lurched forward as if the words had physical force. He attempted to speak, something about context, about urgency, about needing time to explain. Natasha put a hand on his sleeve, the gesture involuntary and instantly recorded by half a dozen cameras. James moved then, with the glacial calm of someone used to official procedure. He alerted the room to a legal packet that had been distributed electronically and to a list of events that had already been logged with a law firm. The tone was not theatrical. "We have presented these materials to the company's board and to appropriate counsel," he said. "We will be sharing them with regulators and investors. We have copies for anyone who wishes to review the chain of custody." An editor in the back checked her watch. An investor paled. Phones began to vibrate with messages. Social feeds lit up like a constellation. The city's gossip circuits, which had once feasted on Elena's assumed decline, now turned ravenous in another direction. The narrative flipped. The appetite for a fall was replaced by the hunger for accountability. Vincent's face went white in a way that makeup could not mask. He laughed too loud, a sound that struggled for purchase. This is selective," he stammered. "You're presenting things out of context." "Context is what we provide," Patricia replied, stepping forward with a folder of paper copies. "The context is the sequence of transfers, the correspondence, and the timeline that shows how certain funds were redirected. We'll give you access to the documents. They stand on their own." An investor, someone whose name carried weight, raised his hand like a judge passing sentence. "If these are accurate," he said, "we have fiduciary concerns." It is a quiet phrase with explosive consequences in the financial world. A fiduciary concern triggers inquiries, then freezes, then a hard look from auditors. The room hummed. Vincent's attempts at damage control quickened into a kind of panic that was thinly couched as composure. He gestured toward his counsel, a man who had always managed to put a neat gloss on questionable choices. The counsel stood too, and began to talk about the need for an independent audit. But Elena had already made another move. With the same hands that had steadied herself through therapy, she handed over a small drive to Michelle. "We've made an appointment with the lead investor's office," she said. "We've shared everything with them directly. We did not bring this to embarrass. We brought this to protect the company." Some guests began to murmur. Natasha clutched at a glass, its rim trembling. She had rehearsed the photograph. She had not rehearsed being the subject of an exposure built from ledgers and recorded words. Outside, the press had started to leak teasers, the first lines replayed across feeds. Inside, the atmosphere turned from social lubricant to legal calculus. Phone calls multiplied, texts spun into threads. An emergency meeting of the board was announced by someone close to the podium. The MC, trying to salvage the event, stammered about schedules and toasts. No one listened. Vincent, whose skill had always been to ride momentum, watched as that momentum turned against him. He had believed that optics could be controlled, that a well-placed smile could negate the arithmetic of transactions. He had misread the room and misread the law, which is ruthless in its own language of documents and timestamps. "What will this mean?" a columnist whispered to the editor beside her. "It will mean scrutiny," the editor said. "It will mean subpoenas if files are incomplete. It will mean investors asking for clawbacks. It will mean questions that are not about sex and scandal but about money. The power of a well-organized set of documents is not in the documents themselves, but in how they compel others to act." The lead investor, when presented with the packet and the ledger trail, called an emergency committee. They convened, not out of malice. Investors are rarely vengeful. They are risk-averse, and the committee's first vote was to pause incoming financing until the facts were clearer. A senior partner in a boutique firm put a call through to a regulator. The regulator's office, which weeks earlier might have dismissed rumors as gossip, now opened a file. Inside the reception, Natasha's face had changed color several times. First there was the blush of embarrassment, then pale disbelief, then the flattening of composure into something like calculation. It takes a peculiar kind of hubris to believe that you can perform virtue when your ledger is private. The audiences of the city's social scene have long memories when it comes to trust. Vincent looked for alliances then, for the men who had once applauded his decisiveness. Some offered cautious words. Others, more concerned about their own exposure, stepped away. Connections fray quickly when money is in question. It is a different economy than the economy of good taste. By the time the press had published their first pieces, the board had called for an independent audit. Investors began to freeze lines of credit pending review. Vendors put projects on hold. The company's stock experienced a dip not reflective simply of rumor but of active withdrawal. The market, which never sleeps on the scent of instability, sniffed and retreated. Vincent's attempts to rally were messy. In private messages that would later be reviewed, he pleaded for time. He offered himself as a steward of continuity. He sent a bland, carefully worded statement to the press that read like an admission of concern while stopping short of admission of guilt. The statement did not assuage. It inflamed. To many observers, it reeked of someone trying to paper over a problem rather than confront it. Natasha, for all her talent at public placation, found fewer supporters than she expected. Friends who had once been quick to RSVP to charity dinners were suddenly checking the terms of their own involvement. Photographers, who had once chased gowns and smiles with flattering angles, now lingered on the expressions of the accused as if capturing an image of accountability. Elena remained composed. She had no thirst for humiliation beyond what was necessary to reveal truth. She had no desire to be cruel. What she wanted was justice clarified by procedure. Over the following days, she met with regulators and with investors, presenting evidence, confirming timelines, and answering questions in a voice that had learned to be precise. The legal consequences were not instantaneous, cinematic revenge. They were procedural, relentless, and bureaucratic, the sort of public reckoning that does not satisfy soap opera appetites, but strips from perpetrators the oxygen they need to continue. A forensic audit was requested, subpoenas followed. A board vote to place Vincent on leave came through after heated exchange.
The firm he had imagined he could pilot without consequence found itself under guardianship as the independent committee reviewed transactions and governance. Not all roads led to jail. Some led to resignations, to clawbacks of bonuses, to civil suits that required public settlements. In financial ecosystems, reputations and access are as punitive as legal penalties.
Vincent's world narrowed. Old allies made exceptions for self-preservation. He found himself at televised interviews where his answers, pulled apart by legal counsel, sounded hamstrung. He experienced, for the first time, the isolation of a man whose social capital could not pay bills that required pristine accounting. Natasha's social calendar emptied. Invitations ceased to be extended. Her phone, once aligned to privileges, began to ring with fewer calls and more questions. People who had once flattered her retreated behind concerns for their own reputations. The city that had once reflected light on her began to show its shadow. As the fallout settled into the predictable machinery of governance and finance, Elena took quieter actions. She followed the legal trail her father had taught her to read. Trusts and holding entities that had been quietly established earlier held firm. They were not traps or conspiracies. They were the common-sense tools of estate planning and corporate governance. What differed here was intent. For her, the structures had been protection. For others, the attempt had been appropriation. Courts, when given proper documentation, are not theatrical. They are administrative. But their rulings carry consequences that ripple outward. There were consequential hearings. There were depositions under fluorescent lights where Vincent's answers strained. There were hearings where Natasha was asked about the nature of her relationships with company vendors and where she had sat on decisions. The city drank in the transcripts like a new kind of page-turner, less juicy perhaps than rumors, but more indelible. Journalists parsed phrases and released them with the clinical delight of people watching a house of cards dismantle itself. Still, Elena kept the human part of the ledger balanced. She did not gloat. She attended no triumphal photo shoots. When the board moved to institute protective measures for the company's future, she offered testimony that focused not on retribution, but on stewardship. She spoke about the company's employees, the donors whose trust had been at stake, the philanthropic programs that needed continuity. Her rhetoric was not antiseptic, it was restorative. There were nights, in the months that followed, when she sat alone and felt the old ache travel up her spine like an echo. Therapy did not end because headlines gave her temporary validation. Physical pain has its own timetable, and memory is not healed by legal victories. Yet she moved differently through the world. Where once her steps had been halting, now they were chosen. Where once she had counted wounds, now she counted resources. The friends who had stood with her, the staff who had helped reconstruct narratives, the advisors who had kept the paperwork immaculate. The media cycle, which feeds on spectacle, eventually turned to other people. But the legal and financial consequences had a longer half-life. Vincent's company, once the darling of analysts, rebounded eventually under new management, but with cuts and with reputational scars that cost him dearly. He resigned from the firms he had wished to call his domains. Natasha's name, which once bought invitations, became a cautionary footnote on donor lists. Their life together, built with haste, ambition, and the assumption that there are no consequences, reorganized itself into private rooms where solicitous friends were fewer and apologies ran thin. Elena, for her part, reclaimed what mattered. The trusts and holding entities helped secure the foundation her father had built. She re-entered public life on her own terms, a board chair with a clear voice on governance, a patron who insisted on transparency in ways that felt almost evangelical to those who had never been scrutinized. She worked with Michelle to build a communications platform that elevated the work of the company's employees who had been threatened by the instability. She positioned herself not as a conqueror, but as a steward. Her rehabilitation continued, not as a miracle, but as a ledger of minutes, exercises, and appointments. She learned to lift the weight of an incision through the strength of routine. She walked without a cane in certain rooms, but she kept the cane by choice, a quiet statement that strength is sometimes chosen rather than assumed. In private, she learned to feel pleasure again in small things. The warmth of a good coat in autumn, the way coffee tasted without bitterness, the laugh of a friend who had not been recalibrated by corporate calculation. There were complicated human moments, an exchange with a board member who had once turned away, a conversation with a charity donor who wanted to know if Elena's pain had been worth the cost. There were also moments of private grief for the loss of what might have been, the life they had described at 25, before lust morphed into ledger lines. She allowed herself mourning without letting it ossify into grievance. In the end, the most satisfying part of her victory was the quietness of it. She had not screamed from rooftops. She had not ruined people for sport. She had instead called in the architecture of accountability. She let evidentiary truth speak and let the systems designed to manage commerce and conduct do what they were supposed to do. The result was not catharsis alone. It was the restoration of order. On an early spring morning, months after the wedding that had turned into a reckoning, Elena stood on a terrace and looked out at the city. The skyline held its usual array of ambition and compromise. She felt neither triumph nor emptiness. She felt a clean sort of relief, the heavy kind that comes when a burden has been resituated and responsibilities have been reclaimed. She thought of the word deadweight and how it had landed in a hospital room like an accusation. She had been judged on a moment. She had chosen to turn that judgment into motion. Her father's voice surfaced then, not as a ghost but as instruction. He had once told her, in a voice that loved accuracy, that legacy is what remains when you make decisions for those who will follow you, not for yourself alone. She carried that lesson in the way she reorganized boards, in how she pushed for governance reforms, in the quiet insistence that institutions outlast the follies of their leaders when anchored by clear procedure. There were consequences no one could have predicted. Vincent faced litigation and a long climb to the reparation of his professional reputation. Natasha retreated from the public life that had once been her stage. They learned, as most people who ride on other people's fortunes eventually learn, that the currency of trust is fragile and expensive to rebuild. Elena, meanwhile, rebuilt on a different axis. She took fewer headlines but deeper roles. She became, in the quiet way of people who have survived public humiliation, an advocate for clearer standards, board transparency, protective governance for family firms, and stronger oversight of personal expenditures routed through corporate structures. Her work saved jobs and reputations elsewhere, which was its own kind of restitution. When she walked into a room now, people measured her differently. They saw not an infirm trophy, but a steward who had turned injury into an instrument of order. She embraced the awkwardness of being admired for something not flashy but necessary: discipline. There were moments of tenderness, too. David called with an invitation to a small dinner. No press, no spectacle, where they talked about markets, about the absurdities of ambition, about the small joys of learning to make a good omelet. Patricia kept working with her as an analyst, and they found, over late-night calls and spreadsheet arguments, a kind of friendship forged in shared labor. James remained close, a legal sentinel who reminded her, in the quiet hours, of the value of clean paperwork and moral clarity. At an event held to mark the relaunch of a philanthropic program Elena had insisted on preserving, a young woman approached her afterwards. "I read the coverage," she said, "and I wondered, how did you keep so calm? How did you not let it break you?" Elena smiled, not the triumphant grin of a victor, but the steadier expression of someone who had learned a limit of things. "Calm is not the absence of fear," she said. "It's the choice to act despite it. And patience is not doing nothing. It is doing the right things at the right times." As she left that evening, the city lights blinked on like proof that life keeps moving. She had suffered. She had planned. She had waited. And when the time came, she had spoken plainly and let systems do their work. They had left her behind for being a dead weight. What they had not anticipated was that what they thought they had abandoned would return with the patient rigor of someone who had learned to refashion pain into purpose. She had not sought to ruin. She had sought to restore. She had not wanted their ruin as a prize. She wanted accountability as a condition of dignity. In her final public statement, given softly to a small group of reporters and then released in full, she said 3 sentences that would be quoted more for their restraint than their flourish. "Trust is earned, and it can be protected. Institutions are more important than individuals. We must build systems that do not allow private desires to become public theft." Then she walked away. She walked away from the spotlight with the quiet of someone who no longer needs an audience to confirm her worth. She walked toward a life that included work, friends, and the continued strengthening of a body that had been patient with progress. She walked with dignity, having reclaimed what was hers, and refused the role that others had made of her. If this story leaves you thinking about how people can be underestimated, and how patience, planning, and integrity can become the instruments of justice, tell us in the comments what you would do if betrayed like Elena. If you want more stories of quiet comebacks and public reckonings, subscribe to our channel.